At any moment in the middle of the South China Sea, a literal war could break out. High-pressure water cannons, naval ramming, and high-seas brawls have already become common, and a much bigger conflict is just one mistake away. But it didn't have to be this way. A decade ago, in July 2016, an arbitral tribunal in The Hague issued a ruling in a landmark case pitting the Philippines against China over their competing claims to the South China Sea. The verdict was a bombshell. Under the United Nations Law of the Sea, 5 judges found that most of China's claims to vast swaths of the South China Sea were invalid, handing a huge victory to the Philippines. Beijing dismissed the verdict as nothing but a scrap of paper. A decade later, China hasn't backed off its illegal claims by a single inch. If anything, the Chinese Coast Guard is more aggressive than ever. It continues to harass both Philippine Coast Guard vessels and regular fishermen with water cannons, military-grade lasers, and even ramming attempts. The South China Sea remains one of Asia's most dangerous flashpoints. This begs the question, what did the verdict actually achieve? And was one of the biggest international lawsuits in history just a massive waste of time? To understand how we got here, look at the map. The South China Sea is one of the most valuable patches of ocean on Earth. Trillions of dollars in global trade passes through the sea, and it sits on massive untapped oil and gas reserves. Under international law, control over the South China Sea's many tiny rocks and reefs means control over hundreds of square miles of ocean and the rich resources in those waters. For precisely that reason, these reefs have become one of Asia's hottest flashpoints, despite being mostly uninhabited, and in some cases entirely underwater at high tide. For decades, 6 different governments have laid claim to various islands and reefs in the South China Sea. China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all argue over which rocks and which patches of ocean they have the right to control. The situation was tense but stable until 2009, when Beijing decided to rewrite the map. Literally. In May 2009, Beijing submitted a map to a UN commission that depicted a huge looping line made up of 9 dashes. That U-shaped line cut off swaths of ocean claimed by other nations. This is the infamous 9-dash line. With a few strokes of a pen, China claimed sovereignty over nearly the entire sea. China's maritime neighbors were furious, chief among them the Philippines. This is Scarborough Shoal, named after a British East India Company vessel that ran aground there in the 18th century. The triangle-shaped reef is claimed by both China and the Philippines, and had been a source of low-level tensions since the 1990s. After China's 9-dash line went public in 2009, tensions over the shoal began to escalate. In April 2012, those tensions boiled over. The Philippine Coast Guard attempted to detain Chinese fishing vessels operating beside Scarborough Shoal. China responded by sending its own flotilla. U.S. officials stepped in to mediate, and by June 2012, Washington had brokered what they thought was a deal for both China and the Philippines to withdraw their boats from Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines kept its word and withdrew. China didn't. They stayed, took control of the reef, and never left. China has maintained de facto control over Scarborough Shoal ever since. In the aftermath, Philippine President Benigno Aquino III weighed his options. There weren't many. Manila was far too weak to challenge Beijing militarily, and past attempts to negotiate directly with China had gone nowhere. The Philippines had one desperate option left: a legal Hail Mary. Gregory Poling is the head of the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He's been following the case since day one, and he explains the logic behind it.
There was a lot of rhetoric at the time from the Philippine government about international law being the tool of the weak, right, to hold the strong accountable. So Philippines loses control of Scarborough in, let's call it, May of 2012, and then the following March they filed the case. That was a direct cause and effect. The theory of the case for the Philippines was, in the absence of any hard power means of getting China to comply with international law, and in a very questionable U.S. commitment under the Obama administration at that time that had clearly failed to deter, the Philippines' best option was to impose diplomatic and reputational cost on Beijing.
China wouldn't like it, but the Philippines couldn't fight Beijing alone. They needed the law on their side, the law of the sea. Created in 1982, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, regulates all human activities, resource management, and jurisdictional boundaries at sea. Some call it the Constitution of the Oceans. Both China and the Philippines have ratified the Law of the Sea, meaning they are bound to respect the convention, or that's how it's supposed to work. In January 2013, Manila took the unprecedented step of filing a legal complaint under the Law of the Sea against China. The Philippines' case consisted of 15 separate submissions and made 3 primary claims. First, they argued that history doesn't override international law. China's 9-dash line rested on an historical claim to the ocean. The Philippines argued that the Law of the Sea trumped any past reality. The second major Philippine argument concerned the maritime features occupied by China in the South China Sea. Manila argued that these should be classified as rocks, low-tide elevations, or submerged banks, rather than islands. It sounds like an arcane legal point, but this classification matters and has far-reaching implications for China's claims. Under the Law of the Sea, a true island is entitled to a massive 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, but a mere rock only gets a tiny 12 nautical mile strip of territorial water. The Philippines argued that China's outposts were just glorified rocks, which would instantly strip Beijing of its sweeping claim to control the surrounding ocean. Third, the Philippines claimed that China had unlawfully operated inside the Philippines' EEZ and continental shelf. Under the Law of the Sea, any state has the right to file a request for arbitration to resolve maritime disputes. And this arbitration is compulsory. That means the other state has to participate, whether it wants to or not.
I think Manila at the time actually did have an expectation that China would take part in the proceedings, even if it did so resistantly. So I don't think Manila went into this expecting that China would be quite as belligerent as it was.
It was a bad sign that Beijing refused to take part in the arbitration at all. That was already a flagrant violation of the law China itself had ratified. The Philippines moved ahead with its legal gambit anyway. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague established an arbitral tribunal to consider who had rightful claim to the South China Sea. It was a massive gamble, and when the judges finally delivered their verdict, it changed everything. After more than 2 years of intense legal battles, the verdict was a total blowout. Out of the 15 claims, the tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines on 14 of them. First, a devastating blow to China's core claim. The tribunal agreed with Manila that Beijing's 9-dash line had no standing under the Law of the Sea. In the judge's own words, there was no legal basis for China to claim historic rights to resources within the sea areas falling within the 9-dash line. While Chinese navigators and fishermen in the distant past may have made use of islands and features in the sea, so did sailors from many other countries. The tribunal said that there was no evidence that China had historically exercised exclusive control over the waters or their resources. Plus, any historic rights China might once have had were extinguished the moment that it signed onto the Law of the Sea in 1996. Second, the tribunal ruled that none of the Chinese-occupied land features in the Spratly Island chain could be classified as islands. Remember, the difference between an island and a rock determines how much of the surrounding ocean a state can claim to control. Because the tribunal only had jurisdiction over maritime disputes, it did not rule on the merits of China's territorial claims over specific islands or rocks. But by denying that these features could generate EEZs, the tribunal effectively reinforced the Philippines' claims to all of the waters within its own EEZ. And finally, the tribunal agreed that China had explicitly violated the Philippines' sovereign rights by damaging the reefs and bullying local fishermen. It was a masterpiece of international law. Beijing's response? They called the verdict null and void and refused to acknowledge it. Like I said before, China had opposed the case from the very start. Beijing argued that the arbitral tribunal lacked jurisdiction in the case and stated that it would not participate in the proceedings. Then Beijing took things a step further. In retaliation, it started massive land reclamation works at features it occupied in the Spratly Islands. Before long, what were once barely rocks above the waves had been turned into artificial islands equipped with radar systems, airstrips, jet hangars, and multi-story buildings. Chinese officials claimed that this construction was unrelated to the arbitration case. Everyone knew better. When the ruling was handed down, China's government scoffed at it. But the international community was paying close attention, and the ruling could have been a game changer.
I think it's hard for people to remember, because so much has obviously happened in the last 10 years, that there was a lot of international attention on this case in July 2016 when it came out, I mean, you had had an expectation that maybe dozens of countries would have called for compliance with the award, including some in Southeast Asia, like Singapore or Indonesia. Never again, even at the height of recent tensions, has there been quite as much international pressure on other governments to speak up.
Luckily for Beijing, however, the Philippines not only wasted this opportunity, it deliberately threw it away. Why? Because the massive legal victory coincided with a change of administration in Manila. Enter Rodrigo Duterte, a gunslinging, filterless former mayor from Davao in the Philippines' deep south. He came to office in June 2016 promising change, and he certainly delivered. Duterte completely upended Philippine foreign policy overnight. He didn't care about the legal victory in The Hague. In fact, he famously dismissed the historic tribunal ruling as just a piece of paper that he would throw in the wastebasket. Instead of taking the ruling up as a weapon to wield against Beijing, Duterte tried to play nice. He launched a massive pro-China pivot, hoping to trade compliance for billions of dollars in Chinese infrastructure funding.
Duterte came into office about 12 days before the ruling came out. Duterte says on day one, this is a piece of waste paper. It's not going to do any good, and I've got a different theory of the case entirely. If I can just be a little nicer, Beijing is going to shower us with money, and it's going to back off on all this aggression in the South China Sea. Neither of those things actually happened. There was no money and there was no decrease in Chinese aggression. But by the time Duterte realized that, all of that momentum around the case had really dissipated. Duterte really let them get off the hook.
Duterte's pro-China pivot squandered the opportunity to build on the momentum of the ruling. As his many critics in the Philippines pointed out, it also failed to make much progress on the resolution of the core crisis. Before too long, China had resumed its pattern of encroachments into Philippine waters. The greatest maritime legal victory in history had been completely neutralized from the inside out, and the Philippines' own government bore much of the blame. Was this whole legal battle just a massive waste of time? On the surface, it certainly looks that way. One shortcoming of the arbitral ruling is that it has no enforcement mechanism. While the tribunal described it as final and binding, China has refused to acknowledge it. As a result, the Philippines has little to show for its victory.
China is not in compliance with any of the 14 parts of the case that the Philippines won, including the artisanal fishing at Scarborough Shoal, which has been kind of turned on and off like a faucet by Beijing when it wants to coerce Manila, and is completely off at the moment.
Meanwhile, the situation in the South China Sea is more tense than it was in 2016. The Philippine legal case led to a downturn in relations with China and prompted Beijing to ramp up its artificial island building and other assertive actions. In recent years, China has increased the frequency and intensity of its incursions into Philippine waters. This has resulted in a string of confrontations between Chinese and Philippine vessels near Philippine-occupied features, including Second Thomas Shoal and Scarborough Shoal, the flashpoint that inspired Manila's legal gambit. But the ruling has also had some positive outcomes for the Philippines. While Manila missed the opportunity to press its advantage under Duterte, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has taken a much stronger line since coming into office in 2022. He has weaponized the 2016 ruling, launching an aggressive transparency campaign to show all the ways China continues to violate international law. Manila started embedding journalists on ships, beaming high-def videos of China's illegal tactics directly to the world. And it's working. At first, only 5 countries backed the ruling. Today, an expanding coalition of nearly 30 nations stand behind the Philippines, formally calling on China to comply with the judgment. The legal ruling, backed by the United Nations Authority, provides the ultimate weapon to push back against Beijing's expansive maritime claims. If nothing else, the ruling completely changed the language China uses to talk about its claims.
It did change Chinese rhetoric. It completely undermined the legitimacy of the, quote, 9-dash line and the historic rights argument, which was the prevailing Chinese legal interpretation of its claim at the time. The court, systematically destroyed that argument.
Chinese academics and officials no longer speak much of historic rights. Instead, they have scrambled to find alternative ways to justify the same claims. By stripping away China's legal excuses, the award has forced Beijing into embarrassing rhetorical gymnastics to justify its actions on the world stage. Meanwhile, the Philippines' fellow claimants, like Vietnam, have used the ruling to their own advantage. Vietnam, Malaysia, and even Indonesia have all plainly cited the 2016 South China Sea ruling to advance their own maritime claims, and reject China's.
None of the Southeast Asian claimants stood up on the day the award came out and said China has to comply with this. But Vietnam sent a friend of the court brief, an amicus brief, to the court before the ruling came out, saying that when you issue your ruling, it will be legally binding, and we will expect China to comply. Indonesia amended its own domestic laws to extend its exclusive economic zone claims based on the precedent the court set about what counts as an island and what doesn't. So these states were very quick to utilize the case. They were very grateful that the Philippines won the case. They just weren't willing to stand up and say it and take any blowback on behalf of Manila.
But can international law actually stop a global superpower? The answer is a surprising yes, even if it hasn't happened yet in the South China Sea. There are other cases in which arbitration and international pressure have succeeded in forcing larger powers to at least partially comply with international law. One notable case is the dispute between Mauritius and the United Kingdom over the Chagos archipelago. The Chagos Islands used to be part of Mauritius back when both were British colonies. But when Mauritius got its independence, Britain kept Chagos. In 2015, Mauritius won its own victory in an arbitration case under the law of the sea, much like the Philippines case decided the next year. And in both cases, the more powerful countries, the UK and China, ignored the rulings against them. But in the Chagos case, that didn't last. Over time, the international legal victory put pressure on London. Mauritius continued to press its rights in the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, and it kept winning. In May 2025, Mauritius and the UK finally signed an agreement that would transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. While the agreement has not yet been implemented, it's seen as inevitable that Mauritius will regain control over the Chagos Islands. But it took a while, 10 years and counting after its first legal victory. So maybe there's still hope for the Philippines in the South China Sea after all. As in the case of Mauritius, international support is quietly growing.
The case is not a dead letter. When the case came out, 5 countries on Earth stood up and said that it was legally binding and should be complied with. Today, it's close to 30. The Marcos administration has been very successful in rallying support, not just from a lot of Europeans, but also the Indians have gone on record supporting it, the Koreans have gone on record supporting it, and I think that number will continue to grow. If we look at similar cases, Mauritius is still working to get the Brits to give away, let's say, Chagos. And they're going to. Everybody knows London will eventually give up Chagos. But to get that to happen, Mauritius had filed 3 separate arbitral cases in the last 2 decades. So these things don't happen overnight.
Mauritius could offer a roadmap for actually turning this so-called piece of paper into a real advantage. The Philippines has already considered continuing its legal campaign, either by pursuing a second arbitration under the law of the sea or by pressing its case in a separate venue such as the UN General Assembly. In doing so, it would have to weigh the potential benefits and chances of success against the likelihood of Chinese retaliation. If one thing is clear, it's that this story is not yet over. A decade on, it is fair to ask whether the arbitral ruling was worth it for the Philippines. But the reality is that it might still be too early to tell. For now, there's evidence that the case made a difference simply by demonstrating that it was possible for a smaller claimant state to say no to China.
The story of the South China Sea for most of the 2010s was one of steady Chinese gains and steady losses of administrative control for all the Southeast Asian claimants. And, I mean, really, in some cases, in absolute free fall. That trend has really plateaued for China from about the end of 2021. By any quantitative metric that we look at, not just the Philippines, but also Vietnam and Malaysia and even Indonesia have gotten much better at standing their ground on key disputed issues. There's just been a series of incidents that have shown that actually when you stand up and you can do it with considerable risk tolerance, Beijing will eventually back off.
Of course, a lot depends on the next Filipino president. Duterte purposefully threw away the Philippines' best chance to enforce the ruling. But the Marcos administration has turned the tide. With another presidential election looming in 2028, the ongoing political feud between the Duterte and Marcos families could determine the fate of the South China Sea. Check out this video for more.